Perfect. So today I am here with Aleshia Ruehl, and Aleshia is the kids minister at Portrait Church. So super excited to chat today, Aleshia. I'm curious, could you tell me a bit about yourself and what called you to your role in Portrait Church?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here. First of all,
Yeah.
I'm excited to be here. Yeah, so I actually did not start out in ministry. I was far from even thinking about ministry, but I always knew
Mhm.
I wanted to work with kids and families.
Mm.
So I started out in a career in finance for 10
Okay.
years,
Oh,
um,
wow.
knowing I wanted to be with kids. So I climbed up the corporate ladder. That was not something that brought me joy. And so I actually went back to school thinking I was going to be a
Mhm.
physical therapist.
Oh, wow.
It was interesting because I didn't know what God's plan was for me yet. And long story short, graduated with honors, had all the testing scores, the references. I
Mhm.
worked in the field for a while. I thought I was doing so great. And the opportunities when I started trying to get into doctorate school kept closing. The doors were just not
Mhm.
opening the way I expected.
Mhm.
And so I actually switched gears. I told my husband, I was like, hey, while I'm still applying for doctorate school, how about I just go get my education degree so that I have something to fall back on just in case? We'll just do this in the meantime. So that was definitely like supposed to just be kind of a stepping stone, a temporary situation. So I graduated, got my degree in teaching, went into public
Mhm.
education. Absolutely loved it. I loved
Okay.
the relational aspect of being with the kids. I loved the teaching. And that's where the God given spiritual gifts started kind of arising for me.
Mhm.
Still really didn't have ministry on the brain. But
Mhm.
as time went on, an opportunity at my church came up for a children's ministry position. And I had some
Awesome.
leaders there that had recognized some of the gifts I had as I was a volunteer in the church and said, hey, Alicia, like, what would you think about children's ministry? What would you think about coming on and being our children's minister? And that was
Mhm.
my Jonah moment. It was no way. No, ministry is not for me. Like, you've got to be crazy. So I went back to my teaching job. It was bringing me joy. I enjoyed it so much. And God just kept kind of giving me this what if kept
Mhm.
coming up to me. What if you went into ministry? What if this is where I'm leading you? What if? So that was it was kind of something my husband and I started praying about at that point,
Mhm.
and I still thought, no, this is ministry is not for me. And I have to take you back just a little bit. At a
Yeah.
previous church we had went to, a ministry job had come up there as well. And at that
Mhm.
time, I was still in kind of the medical realm of thinking
Mhm.
career wise. And the position opened up, and I thought, well, that would be a really cool job, but it's just not for me. We're a blended family. So in my
Mhm.
mind, blended family, a blended mom did not belong in ministry, which is so
Mhm.
crazy. And to think of how young I was in my faith to think blended families weren't in the Bible all the time, teaching and making
Mhm.
big impacts. So fast forward, teaching, I'm standing on the playground. One of my students comes up and says, instead of playing, he comes and stands beside me and he says, Miss Rue, I have a really personal question I need to ask you. And I
Mhm.
thought, oh dear, where is this going? And he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, well, my mom's a Christian and she says she's a Christian and she believes in God and goes to church. But my dad says there's no God and he's an atheist. And what do you believe? Is there a God and what should I think about this? And that
Mhm.
was my moment
Oh,
where
wow.
I knew God was saying, okay, this is your test. Like, I'm calling you. Are you going to answer this call? And it
Mhm.
was that night I went home and just was in tears. And I told my husband, all right, the what ifs, I've listened to those long enough, and God today just smacked me in the face with ministry and said, "This is it." So I knew right then I was being called to ministry. So yeah, we I worked in church several years. Ended up coming closer to home, where
Mhm.
we live. And another opportunity, Martin and I had found a new church. We came in for the first time, first day we
Wow.
were visiting, sat in the back row, and the pastor got up and talked to us about how there was going to be a new church plant, and this was the vision for the church plant where we lived. By the way, we're
Mhm.
driving about 20 minutes to go to church every day.
Yeah.
um, and as he shared this vision, it was exactly what my husband and I were picturing and looking for. And we just sat in
Mm.
the back and cried and squeezed each other's hands because we knew this was it. This was the next thing God was calling us to. And it was about 12 to 18 months later that I was offered an opportunity to come with Portrait Church to open up. And it's literally half a mile from my house, which is amazing.
Awesome. Yeah.
Really cool.
Oh wow. Yeah, well that is quite a story, Alicia. So thanks for sharing. And yeah, that's interesting because one, there's like, hey, really a cool background you have, the experience in finance and then physical therapy, looking into grad school for that. And then educating as an educator, and then being called into ministry. So yeah, I want to pull on that thread also. And then there's also the just a very clear signs from God. Some people maybe it's a little more subtle, but like for you, it's just like, hey, there's one, that the moment with that, the conversation with that kid you had, and then when it's like, hey, we are opening the perfect church, perfect role for you right next to your house. That's I don't know how God can get more obvious than that.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's
Absolutely.
yeah, so kind of two questions from that. The first one is like, yeah, with the different backgrounds you have, like how have those helped you in your role in kids ministry, especially as you're launching, Portrait Church now?
Absolutely, yeah. So I people ask me that actually quite a bit, and
Okay.
it's so at the time I had no idea what God was planning, but now I look back and think about, like you said, pulling that thread, all those opportunities and experiences came together. As a children's minister, I have to create my own budget. I have to
Hmm.
figure out how I'm going to best use the church's resources and make sure that I'm doing it in a godly way. So that's
Hmm.
where my finance comes in. Um,
Yeah.
Part of that was also sales. So kind of,
Yeah.
I feel like, and that relational aspect of being with customers all the time. Well, in
Hmm.
ministry, it's completely relational. Everything we do starts with relationship and building rapport with others, whether it's to uh, pull volunteers into serving, or whether it's children face to face
Hmm.
and growing their relationship with God, or whether it's having an opportunity to share the gospel story. It all starts with relationship, for sure. And then as far as physical therapy, I always feel like that comes in when I go to camp with kids. Kids are always
Yeah.
getting hurt, whether it's,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, tripping in the field or,
Yeah.
everywhere. I feel like I use that more than I thought I would. And then education obviously is the biggest one I use. Just learning how to engage kids with whatever content it is. In the public school, it's learning the basics, math,
Hmm.
English, reading, all the things, but all of that also filters into ministry big time. I know one of the weird things I'm funny about is finding a Bible that a child can engage with, because I did
Hmm.
reading. I was a reading teacher, so I'm
Yeah.
very conscious of reading levels, which is a weird
Mm.
quirk, but it's just
Mhm.
something that has filtered in with me through that education.
Yeah, well, that's cool because, things like that are very, very tactical. Like, hey, is each kid, do they have a Bible at their reading level? Do they maybe need a more advanced Bible? Do they, that stuff's very important because we can do a lot, but there can be just these little things standing in the way of,
Absolutely.
a kid's relationship with Jesus. So it's like, hey, how many of those little things can we see and just kind of move out of the way for them so that they can have a stronger relationship with Christ there. So that's awesome to hear. And yeah, really cool how, something from each of your experiences helps you today. And that's super exciting because, like, as you launch Portrait Church as a plant, it's kind of like, when you launch maybe a company or something, like everyone in those early stages should have lots of skills. And so with that, like, when you got called into Portrait Church, it was like kind of obvious, but there's still like, there can still be doubt, there's still a lot of stuff like that. It's still, there's still uncertainty in things. What advice would you have for folks like leaning into that despite the uncertainty and stuff?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And for sure, the doubts definitely creep in when the enemy sees you doing something and building this, army up of believers and
Mhm.
ready to take on those that haven't yet walked through the door. He's definitely going to attack. And I feel like one of my best advice would be I think that the enemy often attacks our families first, and so
Mm.
to be so protective of your family during that time and your own individual faith, um, I feel like that's where the attacks come from first,
Mm.
to creep in the doubt. Am I doing the right thing for my family? Because ultimately, our first ministry is our families and our own homes. So I
Mm.
think that that's an area that can easily um, pull our focus away from the goal of ministry and the purpose of why we're there. And
Mhm.
so holding fast to making sure that all the little details of launching and preparing do not get in the way of making sure that your house is protected in your faith with your family, your marriage relationship, your relationship with your kids, and making sure that they are not getting forgotten in that process. One of the things I always have to tell myself, which is one of the biggest challenges in ministry in general, I think,
Mm.
is not to love the ministry more than you love God. And
Mm.
that's a
Mhm.
principle I really try to stand by because we can get so caught up in what's the best curriculum to teach kids or what's
Mhm.
the best way to bring in volunteers or what is the best newest trend in the church world,
Yeah.
and we can get so caught up that we forget our own spiritual relationship with God and can let that start petering out without realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very important point you made of like, hey, we have one, our family, our responsibilities to consider and making sure, hey, we're focused on, God first and our ministry is the way we bring people to God. So yeah, that's very important. And it's also important because it seems like, hey, one way I can help support my family is by, doing this role. This role is important. I'm doing this for my family, working in this ministry. So when it comes to just like what you focus on in ministry, like what are some of the core values you, maybe the rest of the team as well at Portrait Church operate by?
Sure. So, one of our cultural value statements, we use the acronym FRAME. So
Hmm,
each of
awesome.
the letters of this acronym stand for the things that we hold most true and want to set our foundation on. So F is first things first. Our relationship with God comes first, just kind of like what we just talked about.
Hmm.
Um, Family ministry, our spiritual walk with God comes first before anything else. R is relationship over everything. So
Hmm.
we're going to make sure that we really plug into relationships We like to say that no one's going to out relationship portrait. That's really
Okay.
important to us is
Yeah.
creating that community and those relationships, that building that trust and rapport, kind of like I said earlier, um,
Hmm.
and not letting religion outweigh relationship. A is
Hmm.
always honor. So we always want to honor each other. We're not talking about each other behind their backs. We're making sure to lift each other up and encourage each other in the body.
Yeah.
The M is make room for the Holy Spirit. So, not be so set on our plans that we have
Hmm.
backed ourselves into an area where we have not made room for the Holy Spirit to be spontaneous and do what it is that He has in mind for us, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not our ministry, it's His. And then
Exactly.
um, our E is expand the kingdom. So we
Hmm.
were blessed to be able to go in church plant, but we also want to be able to expand that kingdom even further. So one of the things I love to hear our pastor David say is we want to plant pregnant. So
Yeah.
we want to plant with the idea that we're eventually going to get to bless someone else and
Mhm.
open up another church plant in the future.
Yeah, well, love that. All those values are very important, and it's really, I think, gonna take you a long way in expanding the kingdom at Portrait. I really like what you said, like, hey, no one's gonna out relationship Portrait, and that is the one. Relationships are important for any ministry, especially as a new ministry, though, being new in the community, building relationships with people. Like, what are some ways you found are just the best ways to connect with people as a new church and build those relationships?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a variety of ways. Some of the ways we've started out with is just taking time to start with small groups. Like our
Hmm.
men meet at a coffee shop on Friday mornings and just have that community of men that can get together and pray together and talk about
Hmm.
life struggles and what the wins are. We have groups of women that get together and we call it she brews. So they
Awesome.
get to go together and have coffee and
Very cool.
devotionals. We have events where we call them culture nights, where it's
Hmm.
just a gathering of all our volunteers and anybody that's interested in just hearing to look again into what God has in store for them.
Hmm.
So I think that a lot of it just has to do with authentic relationship and just really plugging into people's lives. We also have
Yeah.
what we call portrait groups that are starting up now, which are our version of small groups to get
Hmm.
people plugged into a community of believers to strengthen their faith and to just continue loving on each other, getting to know each other, and just being able to experience life together.
Oh yeah. Well, I like that a lot, especially the Shebrews. That group name is awesome. So very, very cool. So yeah, well, that's spectacular. Exciting to hear you're getting the portrait groups, going here soon. So that is very cool because that's one of just the most important things for helping people find those relationships as they walk on their journey. So yeah, well, that's very, very exciting. And we've touched on a lot of stuff, and I know, because you kind of wear a lot of hats as a new church. But let's kind of dive into kids ministry specifically. So, like, when you look at your kids ministry, like, what are some of your top goals for both the short and long term, and then also challenges you have as you look to achieving these goals?
Sure, great question. So, as far as short-term goals, I would say I'm very much a believer in the Bible should never be boring.
Yep,
I always say making the Bible boring should be a sin. So,
indeed.
I'm a big believer in everybody is made so different and has
Mhm.
a different spiritual gift. They have abilities, skills, um, all these things that make them different and unique. And
Mhm.
so with that comes different learning styles. So I'm a
Yep.
big believer in allowing kids to engage and experience the Bible to inspire them beyond the church building or beyond the doors, to really incorporate that into life application. So
Mm,
I think that stories are so important, and we live by stories, and stories are what really stick with us more than maybe a sermon or a
mm,
particular thing we've learned in school. Stories kind of tend to stay with us. And
yeah.
so the more that we can engage kids to experience that story, whether it's hands-on, whether it's through music, whether it's through a kinesthetic activity, when we can
Mhm.
bring those things to life, for example, maybe telling the story of Jonah and sitting under a tent or fort to make it look like we're sitting inside the belly of a well. And maybe we have a
Ah,
can of tuna fish sitting there for the smell, and just
right.
all the ways we can experience that Bible is going to stick with a child longer. So some of my
Mhm.
short-term goals is making sure, I like to call it engaging, not staging. So
Mm,
engaging kids
mhm,
in the lesson, not just staging curriculum as is, but really
mhm,
combing through those curriculums and figuring out how can I make this creative and engaging for kids to enjoy and to stick with them.
mhm,
But then also not just to stick with them, but asking those questions and fueling that curiosity to go beyond the doors of the church, right? To go
mhm.
beyond and figure out, okay, now that I've experienced this, how do I now transition this story into my own life? How does it apply to me? And how can I take this and live this out?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I really like, hey, engaging, not staging. Okay, and yeah, making it memorable, making sure each kid has something where they can really learn, have it do more than stick with them, and then apply it to their own lives is very important. And so, with that, what are like the top kind of challenges that stand in the way of this, or maybe things that were hard at first to overcome, or someone that would like to do more stuff like this. It's like, hey, I'm hoping to make these lessons that are more engaging at my church, but I'm not sure where to start. Like, what would you typically recommend?
Sure. That's a very good question. And I would say probably the number one challenge is time management.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it really does take a lot of time to sit through and
Mhm.
comb through and figure out how you can manipulate curriculum to really thrive for the kids in the classroom. I would say my advice would probably be, whatever curriculum you land on, there's never a one size fits all.
Mhm.
So whatever you end up with deciding, because there's so many great curriculums out there, I think that there's also so much wisdom and experience in those curriculums, but also like picking and pulling from different ones and figuring out how your kids are best interacting with curriculum, and what are those moments that you're really seeing the light bulb go off for those kids. And sometimes it's being able to pivot quickly,
Mhm.
and being flexible and not getting so married to one curriculum, but finding what works for your kids and what excites them and brings them joy and passion.
Yeah. It goes with what you said earlier about your value, like, hey, make room for the Holy Spirit, because if we're set to a plan and then something changes and the plan just doesn't work anymore, then yeah, we got to be flexible. So
That's
yeah,
absolutely right.
it comes back to that core value you had, which is why I really just like that frame value you mentioned. So, yeah, well, that is spectacular, Alicia, and really, shared a lot of great advice today. I'm curious, just like, what other advice would you have for kids ministry leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say for one, always we're always learning. I call myself a lifelong learner. We
Cool.
have never reached the point where we're not learning and we've just hit the top.
Uh-huh.
So, uh, two questions I always like to ask is who am I developing and who's developing me?
Mm,
So, when we I think as ministry leaders, we're always looking to see what would happen if I left ministry? What legacy would I leave? So if
mm,
I'm always very passionate about growing and developing that next leader.
yeah.
So if I could step away from the ministry, could it still run? Does it still thrive without me? That would be my
Mhm,
ultimate goal. So always, what am I learning from? What books could I be, resources could I be using to grow myself? What podcasts could I be listening to? What, who are some top three gurus in my area of
yeah.
ministry that I can be leaning on? I would also say as far as uh, advice for other leaders is just protect your spiritual life.
Mm,
After great moments that arise and form from God, then comes the storm, right?
yeah.
And we kind of talked about that earlier. And I feel like ministry leaders are the best targets for attack. So just to
Mm,
stay strong, lean on your faith. Joshua 1:9 tells us, do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Just remembering
absolutely.
he's there through the storm. We had Jesus in the boat that calmed the storm right after they had this great moment of feeding the 5,000. So there's
Yeah.
always going to be these great moments. There's going to be valleys, and God is with us through it all. And just to always remember that.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is spectacular. So I'd love to leave it on that note, but I'm curious because you mentioned growing a lot. Like, what are some books and podcasts you'd recommend? Maybe some of your favorites or you found most helpful?
Yeah. So Josh Denhart, Lead Ministry, is one of my
Mm,
all-time favorites. I absolutely love
absolutely.
that one. And I'm a little partial, but because I also do coaching for Josh, but he has mentored me for probably more than 5 years, and he is
Oh
just
wow.
an absolute joy to be around. Lot of experience, a lot of great
Awesome.
advice. Just love him.
Mm,
Another one I would say is I love to listen to Ryan Frank's Kids Matter. Kids
mhm,
Matter website has some great resources on there for preteens. I love to listen to Sean Sweet, who has 456 curriculum. He's got a
mhm.
lot of great resources there for ministers, free resources you can go and check out.
Yeah.
Some other books and resources I love are Sam Chan. There's one about the ladder. I think it's called Ladder Leadership or something like that.
Mm.
That's a fantastic one as well. Lots of great resources out there for leaders. I think that there is an abundance, and you can't go too wrong as long as you're always continuing to seek to learn.
Absolutely. Well, could not agree more there. So it's been a pleasure, Alicia, and thank you so much for sharing so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.